Robert Lewis Dabney was a Presbyterian minister and theologian, and eventually the chief of staff to Stonewall Jackson. That was in the future, however. In the spring of 1861, Dabney wrote a friend, a Northern Presbyterian minister named Reverend Samuel Prime, one of the editors of the New York Observer, about the political situation in the country of the day. Dabney wrote on April 20th, 1861, 5 days after Lincoln's call for troops, and 3 days after Virginia voted to leave the Union. This is what Dabney wrote.
Communications for the Central Presbyterian. April 20th, 1861. Reverend S.J. Prime, D.D. On April 15th, Lincoln called for troops to attack the South. This appeal to arms in such a cause is as dangerous to your rights as to ours. Let it be carried out, and whatever may have befallen us, it will leave you with a consolidated federal government, with state sovereignty extinguished, with the Constitution in ruins, and with your rights and safety a prey to a frightful combination of radicalism and military despotism. If war is thrust upon us, you should be found on our side, contending for the supremacy of law and constitutional safeguards, with a courage worthy of the heroes of Saratoga and Trenton. How horrible is this war to be, of a whole North against a whole South. Not to dwell on all its incidents of shame and misery. Let us ask, who are to fight it out to its bitter issue? Not the tongue-valiant brawlers, who have inflamed the feud by their prating lies about the barbarism of slavery. These pitiful miscreants are already hiding their cowardly persons from the storm. And its brunt must be borne by the honest, the misguided, the patriotic men of the North, who in a moment of madness have been thrust into this false position. And what can this war effect, except mischief? Will it restore the supremacy of federal laws over the seceded states? Can you conquer the United South? Can you conquer the 7 Confederate states? And when Virginia has joined her sisters, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, and they have rallied to their sides their stalwart daughters of the West, is there one abolitionist insane enough in the fury of his sectional hate to believe that he can conquer them all? Then what can this war effect, save to shed rivers of treasure and of more precious blood, to plant the seeds of national hatred, which are to bear fruits in other wars, for centuries, and to rend this Union forever, beyond the hope of reconstruction? Why then, do you go to war with us? Let it not be replied that it is South Carolina which has first gone to war with you, and that Virginia has made herself particips criminis by refusing to permit a righteous chastisement. This is what clamoring demagogues say. But before an enlightened posterity, as before impartial spectators, it is false. And here let us distinctly understand the ground the conservative North means to occupy, as to the independence of the states and their reserved rights. If you do indeed construe the federal compact so that ruthless majority may perpetrate unconstitutional wrong, may trample on the sacred authority of the Supreme Court, and may pervert all the powers of the federal government, instituted for the equal good of all, to the depression of a class of rights as much recognized by the Constitution as any other, and the minority have no remedy except submission. If you mean that sovereign states, the creators by their free act, of these federal authorities, are to be the helpless slaves, in the last resort, of their own servant. If you mean that one party is to keep or break the compact as his arrogance, interest, or caprice may dictate, and the other is to be held bound by it at the point of the sword. If you mean that a sovereign state is not to be the judge of its own wrong and its own redress, when all constitutional appeals have failed, then we say that it is high time we understood each other. Then was this much lauded federal compact a monstrous fraud, a horrid trap, and we do well to free ourselves and our children from it, at the expense of all the horrors of another revolutionary war. Are we to be held offenders, because we attempted peacefully to exercise the last remaining remedy, and to pluck our liberties and the principles of this Constitution, from the vandal hands which were rending them all, by quiet secession? Nay, verily. Of all men in the world, the conservative men of the North cannot condemn that act. For they have declared the Constitution broken. And they have proved themselves incompetent to restore it. In the ordinance of 1787 in which Virginia first accepted this Constitution, she expressly reserved to herself the right to sever its bonds whenever she judged they were used injuriously to her covenanted rights. It was on this condition she was received into the family of states. And her reception on this condition was a concession of it by her partners. From that condition she has never for 1 hour seceded. Witness this spirit of the resolutions of 1798, 1799, and now shall she be called covenant breaker, because she judges that the time has come to exercise her right expressly reserved. Nay, verily. If then, we have the right of peaceably severing our connection with the former Confederation, and the attempt has been made by force to obstruct that right. They who attempted the obstruction are the first aggressors. The first act of war was committed by the government of Washington against South Carolina, when fortresses intended lawfully only for her protection were armed for her subjugation. The act of war was repeated when armed preparations were twice made to reinforce these means of her oppression. It was repeated when she was formally notified that these means of her oppression would be strengthened peaceably if they could be, forcibly if they must. And then, at last, after a magnanimous forbearance, little expected of her ardent nature, she proceeded to what was an act of strict self-defense, the reduction of Fort Sumter. The South has not seceded because it wished to commit robbery. As for the forts within their borders, the only legitimate use the United States could have for them was to protect those states. When we relinquish all claims on that protection, what desire can the federal government have to retain them, save as instruments of oppression? But it is said, in fine, if the right of secession is allowed, then our government is only a rope of sand. I reply, demonstratively, that the government of which Virginia has been a member has always had this condition in it as to her. For her right to go out of it whenever she judged herself injured by it was expressly reserved and conceded from the first. And if you find that the voice of justice and reason is no longer permitted to be heard in the North, that the friends of the Constitution cannot lift their hands there with safety in its defense, then we invite you and all true men to come to this sunny land and help us here to construct and defend another temple where constitutional liberty may abide secure and untarnished. For you, we have open arms and warm hearts. For our enemies, resistance to the death. Yours in the bonds of the gospel, R. L. Dabney.
So what does all this mean? But first off, Dabney does not mention slavery but once, and then only to deny the Northern criticisms of it. This is not a defense of slavery. Next, Dabney argues that Northern men of good faith should be fighting alongside the South to protect constitutional principles. In the closing paragraph, he welcomes Northern men of good faith to come south and to, quote, construct and defend another temple where constitutional liberty may abide secure and untarnished, close quote. So he's extending his hand across the sectional boundary to good Northern men, inviting them to come and help. He is not being exclusionary along sectional lines. Next, Dabney shows that the states created the federal government, delegated powers to it, and when the powers they delegated to it were perverted to their injury and oppression, they reserved the right to withdraw. Virginia had explicitly stated as much when ratifying the Constitution in 1788. Dabney argues that the Union was always divisible. It was the condition upon which Virginia joined the Union in the first place. Next, if the states cannot escape and are in fact slaves to the federal government, then the Constitution becomes, quote, a monstrous fraud and a horrid trap, close quote, and, quote, the horrors of another Revolutionary War, close quote, are worth it to save future generations from a federal government that does not respect its limits. He was thinking about posterity and their liberty. Finally, the only rationale for federal authorities holding Fort Sumter was to oppress the seceded states. Once they had left, that was the only reason the federal government could keep a fort in the South. South Carolina had acted only after the seizure of Fort Sumter by federal authorities moving over from Fort Moultrie, and two federal attempts to reinforce the fort whose only existence in Charleston was to oppress the people of the state. Thus, South Carolina had acted in strict self-defense, and the North were the aggressors. So this letter shows what one Southern man was thinking at the very dawn of the war for Southern independence.